A black nurse was doing his medical checkup when the millionaire said, "You're beautiful, you know that? Hello, my most beautiful, most cherished family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories. If only you could feel what I feel for you. The kind of love that doesn't fade, even when the screen is off. You're not just faces behind phones. You're the soul of this space, the light in my every dark day. You're not just part of this family. You are this family. Sometimes my heart quietly breaks when I notice you watched, but didn't comment. Not because of numbers, but because I just need to know you're still here, still holding my hand. I don't want to beg for love that we both know is real. So today, if this love still lives inside you, whisper in the comments, "You are not alone." Because when you say it, you're not only reminding me, you're letting every silent heart in this family know we still belong to each other. Your presence means more than fame, more than views, more than anything in this world. You are my peace, my purpose, my forever people. Here is my soul's prayer for you. May your heart always find the courage to hope again. May love find you before loneliness does. May your home be filled with peace and your spirit protected by unseen angels. And may you always know, no matter the distance or time, you are so deeply, endlessly loved. Let's start again, stronger, closer, more united. You are not alone, and neither am I, because I have you. Rain hammered against the windshield of Bernard Ellison's Aston Martin as he pulled into the parking lot of St. Mary's Community Clinic, his jaw clenched with frustration. The minor collision on Fifth Avenue should have been nothing more than an insurance claim, but the throbbing in his left temple and the gash above his eyebrow demanded medical attention. More importantly, it demanded discretion. The last thing the 34-year-old CEO of Ellison Industries needed was paparazzi swarming an upscale hospital, turning a simple accident into tabloid fodder about his bachelor lifestyle. Bernard had everything society told him he should want: a billion-dollar empire built from his grandfather's oil fortune, penthouses in 3 cities, and enough power to shift markets with a single decision. Yet sitting in his leather seat, watching the neon emergency sign flicker through the downpour, he felt the familiar hollow ache that had become his constant companion. Success, he'd discovered, was a cold and lonely bedfellow. The clinic's waiting room was a stark contrast to the marble lobbies and crystal chandeliers of his usual world. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on cracked linoleum floors. The air smelled of disinfectant and desperation, filled with the quiet conversations of people who couldn't afford better care. Bernard adjusted his expensive watch, suddenly self-conscious about the Rolex that cost more than most of these people made in a year. "Mr. Ellison," a voice called from behind the reception desk. "Room 3 is ready for you." He followed a tired-looking receptionist down a narrow hallway lined with health posters and motivational quotes that had seen better days. Room 3 was barely larger than his walk-in closet, containing only an examination table, a rolling stool, and a small desk cluttered with medical supplies. The fluorescent light above hummed with the same persistent buzz as the waiting room. Bernard had just settled onto the paper-covered examination table when the door opened, and his entire world shifted on its axis. She moved with a dancer's grace and a fighter's confidence, a woman who had earned every ounce of respect through sheer determination. Her honey-golden skin seemed to glow under the harsh fluorescent lights, and when her amber eyes met his, Bernard felt his breath catch. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, rebellious curls framing a face so stunning it made him question whether he'd hit his head harder than he'd thought. "I'm Angela Morris, your nurse practitioner," she said, her voice melodious yet professional as she reviewed his chart. "Mr. Ellison, is it? I understand you were in an automobile accident." Bernard found himself staring, completely forgetting how to form words. Everything about her commanded attention. The way she moved with purposeful efficiency, the gentle strength in her hands as she set down his chart, the fire that seemed to burn behind those incredible eyes. He'd been around beautiful women his entire life, models and socialites who draped themselves on his arm for photos and galas, but none of them had ever made him forget his own name. "Mr. Ellison." Angela's voice cut through his thoughts, and he realized she was looking at him with raised eyebrows, waiting for an answer. "Yes, sorry," he managed, his voice rougher than usual. "Minor collision on Fifth Avenue. Nothing serious, but—" He gestured vaguely at the cut above his eyebrow. Angela moved closer, and Bernard caught the subtle scent of her perfume. Something warm and floral that made his head spin more than any head injury could. She pulled on latex gloves with practiced efficiency, then gently tilted his head to examine the wound. Her touch was impossibly soft, and Bernard had to grip the edges of the examination table to keep from leaning into her hands. "This doesn't look too deep," she murmured, her breath warm against his temple as she cleaned the cut with antiseptic. "You'll need a few butterfly bandages, but no stitches." Bernard watched her work, mesmerized by her concentration, the way she bit her lower lip slightly when she focused. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the kind that came from working too many double shifts and carrying too many burdens. There was something else there too, a wariness, a guardedness, that spoke of old wounds that ran deeper than any physical injury. "You're beautiful," he whispered before he could stop himself. "You know that." The words hung in the air between them like a live wire. Angela's hands stilled on his forehead, and when she pulled back to look at him, her amber eyes flashed with something dangerous, not flattered surprise, but pure, molten fury. "Excuse me?" Her voice was ice and fire combined, each word carefully controlled but burning with anger. Bernard realized his mistake immediately, but it was too late to take it back. In his world, compliments were currency, traded freely between people who used charm as a weapon. But looking at Angela's face, he understood that his words had landed like a slap rather than a caress. "I didn't mean," he started, but Angela stepped back, crossing her arms over her chest like armor. "Let me guess," she said, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You're used to women melting at your feet when you throw them a bone. Like that? Used to buying your way into hearts with pretty words and prettier presents? That's not what rich men like you are all the same," Angela continued, her eyes blazing with a fire that took Bernard's breath away for entirely different reasons. "You think everyone else exists for your entertainment, your pleasure, your convenience. You think a compliment from someone like you should have me grateful and simpering." The venom in her voice hit Bernard like a physical blow. He'd expected maybe embarrassment, perhaps a shy smile, certainly not this beautiful, terrible anger that seemed to consume the entire room. "You don't know anything about me," he said quietly, trying to understand where this fury was coming from. Angela laughed, but there was no humor in it, only pain so deep it made Bernard's chest ache. "I know enough. I know your type, because one of your type destroyed my family." Her hands were shaking now, and she clasped them together to still them. "When I was 12 years old, a rich man, a millionaire oil executive named Richard Harrington, 3, swept my teenage mother off her feet with his charm and his money and his promises of a better life." Bernard felt his blood turn to ice. Richard Harrington III. He knew that name, knew the man. Old oil money, East Coast elite, the kind of ruthless businessman who crushed competitors and collected trophies, including, apparently, people. "He married her," Angela continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, fueled by years of suppressed pain. "Made her dependent on him, made her believe she was nothing without him. Then when the novelty wore off, when she got pregnant with me and wasn't his perfect little plaything anymore, he threw us away like garbage. Literally, we went from a mansion to a homeless shelter in one day because he decided he was bored. The raw pain in her voice made Bernard want to reach for her, to comfort her somehow, but the fire in her eyes warned him to stay back. "My mother never recovered," Angela whispered, and now Bernard could see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "She spent the rest of her life broken, warning me never to trust love, never to trust men with money, because rich men destroy everything they touch. They take what they want and leave ruins behind." Bernard sat in stunned silence, his heart breaking for the 12-year-old girl who had watched her world crumble, for the woman standing before him now who carried those scars like invisible armor. He wanted to tell her that not all wealthy men were like Harrington, that he would never hurt her, that what he'd said came from genuine awe at her beauty, not entitlement. But looking at her fierce, wounded eyes, he realized that words wouldn't matter. Nothing he could say would erase the damage that had been done, the walls that had been built to protect a heart that had learned too young that love was dangerous. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words feeling inadequate but genuine. "I'm sorry that happened to you, and I'm sorry for being presumptuous." Angela studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether his apology was real. Slowly, some of the fire dimmed in her eyes, replaced by the professional mask she wore like protection. "Let me finish treating your cut," she said quietly, moving back toward him with careful, measured steps. As she applied the butterfly bandages with gentle precision, Bernard found himself studying her profile, the elegant line of her neck, the way her lashes cast shadows on her cheeks. She was even more beautiful when she was passionate, even in anger, and he felt something shift deep in his chest, something dangerous and consuming and completely foreign to his carefully controlled world. When she finished, Angela stepped back and removed her gloves with businesslike efficiency. "Keep the bandages dry for 24 hours. Take ibuprofen for any pain. If you experience dizziness, nausea, or blurred vision, seek immediate medical attention." "Thank you," Bernard said, sliding down from the examination table. As he reached for his wallet to pay, he found himself studying her again, memorizing every detail. "Angela Morris," he said softly, reading her name tag. "That's a beautiful name." For just a moment, her professional mask slipped, and he saw something flicker in her eyes. Not anger this time, but something softer and more dangerous. Then it was gone, replaced by cool politeness. "Good night, Mr. Ellison," she said, holding the door open for him. As Bernard walked back through the clinic's waiting room and out into the rain, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine fascination, the kind that had nothing to do with conquest and everything to do with recognition. Angela Morris, with her honey-golden skin and amber fire, had just awakened something in him that all the money in the world couldn't buy. Standing beside his Aston Martin in the rain, Bernard made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He was going to see her again, but next time he would make sure she saw him as a man, not a symbol of everything she had learned to hate. He had no idea that winning Angela Morris's heart would require him to lose himself completely, and that it would be the most beautiful destruction he'd ever experienced. Chapter 2. The Beautiful Lie begins. 3 weeks after their encounter at the clinic, Bernard Ellison stood before his bathroom mirror, barely recognizing his reflection. Gone was the perfectly groomed billionaire CEO with his $1,000 haircuts and manicured hands. In his place stood Ben, a construction worker with calloused palms, sun-weathered skin, and clothes that bore honest wear. The transformation had been methodical, almost obsessive. Bernard had spent hours at construction sites he secretly owned, letting his hands roughen with real labor, his skin darken under genuine sun. He'd practiced modifying his speech patterns, softening the sharp edges of his Ivy League education into something more authentic and accessible. His personal shopper had been replaced with thrift store visits, his Armani suits traded for worn denim and flannel shirts that smelled of sawdust instead of expensive cologne. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was spending more money than most people earned in a lifetime to appear poor, hiring private investigators to learn everything about Angela Morris, while carefully erasing any trace of his own wealth from the narrative he was creating. What he'd learned about her only deepened his fascination. Angela worked 3 jobs: nursing at the clinic, waitressing at Rosa's diner on weekends, and doing medical transcription from her tiny apartment late into the night. Every penny went toward paying off her nursing school loans or supporting her mother, Clara, who cleaned office buildings despite her arthritis because pride wouldn't let her accept charity. The Morris women lived in a world where every dollar was precious, where dreams were luxuries they couldn't afford, where trust was earned through actions, not words. It was so far from Bernard's reality of bottomless bank accounts and casual extravagance that it might as well have been another planet, which was exactly why his plan was so dangerous and so necessary. Rosa's diner sat on the corner of 5th and Morrison, a weathered building with neon signs that flickered sporadically and windows fogged with steam from the kitchen. Bernard had been watching it for 3 nights, learning the rhythms of Angela's schedule, the way she moved between tables with tired grace, how she smiled at regular customers while professional distance remained in her eyes. Tonight, she was working the late shift, her honey-golden skin gleaming under the diner's harsh fluorescent lights as she refilled coffee cups and took orders from truck drivers and night shift workers. She'd traded her scrubs for a simple uniform, a pink dress that hugged her curves, and an apron that somehow made her look even more beautiful than she had in the clinic. Bernard waited until nearly midnight, when the crowd had thinned to just a few stragglers, before pushing through the diner's glass door. A bell chimed overhead, and Angela looked up from wiping down the counter. For a moment her eyes widened with recognition, then narrowed with suspicion. "Mr. Ellison," she said carefully, her voice neutral but guarded. "What are you doing here?" "It's Ben, actually," Bernard said, sliding onto a stool at the counter. He'd practiced this moment 100 times, but now that he was here, looking into those incredible amber eyes, his carefully rehearsed lines evaporated. "Bernard's my middle name. Most people call me Ben." Angela studied him, clearly trying to reconcile the man before her with the wealthy patient she'd treated weeks ago. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced with worn jeans and a flannel shirt. His hands, which she remembered as soft and manicured, now bore the calluses and small cuts of someone who worked with them. Even his posture was different, less commanding, more humble. "You look—" she started, then caught herself as if remembering her own rules about getting too personal with customers. "Different?" Bernard supplied with a self-deprecating smile. "Yeah, I clean up okay for doctor visits, but this is the real me, construction foreman, Morrison Building Company. I was actually just getting off my shift when I saw this place was still open. Figured I'd grab some coffee before heading home. It was a carefully constructed lie built on research and preparation. Morrison Building Company existed. Bernard had purchased it 3 days ago specifically for this purpose. The shift he'd just finished was real manual labor at one of his own construction sites, supervised by foremen who thought they were training a new investor's eccentric son. Angela hesitated, then reached for the coffee pot. "Coffee's been sitting. A while, might be stronger than you're used to." "Perfect," Bernard said, watching as she filled a heavy ceramic mug. Her movements were efficient but graceful, and he found himself mesmerized by the simple act of watching her work. "Long day." "Long week," Angela admitted, leaning against the counter. Now that the initial shock of seeing him had faded, she seemed To relax slightly. You mentioned construction. That's got to be tough work. Bernard looked down at his hands, at the real calluses and scratches he'd earned over the past 3 weeks. It is, but it's honest work. There's something satisfying about building something with your own hands, you know? Creating something that wasn't there before. Something in his voice must have struck a chord, because Angela's guarded expression softened slightly. I know exactly what you mean. That's how I feel about nursing. Like I'm helping build people back up when they're broken. Their eyes met across the counter, and Bernard felt that same electric connection he'd experienced in the clinic. But this time, without the barrier of his wealth between them, it felt real in a way that terrified and exhilarated him. "Can I ask you something?" Angela said, refilling his cup without being asked. "That night at the clinic you seemed different, more formal. Was that because of the accident, or were you putting on an act?" The question hit closer to home than she could possibly know. Bernard chose his words carefully, weaving truth through the lies like golden thread through dark fabric. "Maybe a little of both," he said honestly. "Sometimes when you're hurt or in an unfamiliar place, you put up walls. Act like someone you think you should be instead of who you are." He met her eyes. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable that night. That wasn't my intention." Angela studied his face, as if trying to read the truth there. "You apologized then, too. Most men in your situation, it wouldn't have. My situation. Men who can afford expensive watches and cars," she said pointedly. "Men who think the world owes them something." Bernard felt his heart stop. Had she seen through his disguise already? But then she continued, and he realized she was talking about the wealthy man she thought he'd been that night, not the construction worker sitting before her now. "This watch?" Bernard looked down at the modest Timex he'd purchased specifically for this persona, saved up for 3 months to buy it. "And the car, well, let's just say it's got more miles on it than I care to count." Angela's expression shifted, and Bernard saw something that made his chest tighten. Guilt. She was feeling bad for judging him based on what she perceived that night. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I made assumptions. It's just I've learned to be careful around men with money. They usually want something I'm not willing to give." "What if I told you I don't have any money?" Bernard asked, the irony of the statement making his throat tight. "What if I told you I work 60-hour weeks just to make rent, that I eat ramen more often than I care to admit, and that this coffee is probably going to be the highlight of my day?" Angela laughed, and the sound was like music, warm and genuine, and completely unguarded. "Then I'd say you sound like most of us around here." They talked until dawn began to creep through the diner's windows, painting the world in soft shades of gold and pink. Bernard learned that Angela dreamed of opening a free community health clinic, a place where people like her neighbors could get quality care regardless of their ability to pay. Her eyes lit up when she talked about it, her whole face transforming, with passion and hope. "It sounds impossible sometimes," she admitted, refilling their coffee cups for the 4th time. "The startup costs alone would be hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then there's equipment, staff, insurance. But I keep thinking about Mrs. Rodriguez down the hall from me, how she rations her insulin because she can't afford the full prescription. Or little Tommy Chen, whose asthma inhaler costs more than his parents make in a week." Bernard listened, his heart breaking and soaring simultaneously. Here was a woman whose dreams were built around helping others, who saw wealth not as something to accumulate, but as a tool to heal and uplift. The contrast to his own world, where money was power and power was everything, was staggering. "You'll do it," he said with quiet conviction. "Maybe not today or tomorrow, but you'll find a way. People with hearts like yours always do." Angela looked at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected such certainty from a stranger. "You sound pretty sure about that." "I am," Bernard said, meaning it completely. "I've never met anyone who talks about their dreams the way you do. like they're not just wishes, but promises you're making to the world. The sun was fully up now, streaming through the windows and making Angela's skin glow like burnished gold. She looked tired but beautiful, her defenses lowered by the intimacy of shared stories and the vulnerability that came with dawn. "I should probably let you get home," she said reluctantly, "and I need to get ready for my shift at the clinic." Bernard nodded, though every fibre of his being wanted to stay, to keep talking, to live in this bubble where he was just Ben, and she was just Angela, and the complications of his real life didn't exist. "Maybe I could see you again," he asked, standing and reaching for his wallet. "I mean, if you'd want to, maybe grab dinner sometime, somewhere that doesn't smell like coffee and bacon grease." Angela hesitated, and Bernard held his breath. Everything hinged on this moment, whether she would give him a chance, whether the connection he felt was real or just his imagination. "I'd like that," she said finally, her smile shy but genuine. "But fair warning, I'm not easy to impress. Fancy restaurants and expensive gestures don't work on me." If only she knew, Bernard thought. How refreshing that was to hear. "Good thing I'm more of a picnic-in-the-park kind of guy," he said, leaving money on the counter for his coffee and a generous tip that wouldn't seem out of place from a construction worker who'd had a good week. As he walked out into the morning sunlight, Bernard felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the calculated confidence that came with knowing he could buy anything he wanted, but the uncertain, beautiful hope of a man who had found something worth fighting for. He was playing a dangerous game, building a relationship on a foundation of lies. But as he thought about Angela's laugh, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about helping people, the gentle strength in her hands as she'd poured his coffee, Bernard knew he was already too far gone to turn back. For the first time in his life, he'd found something money couldn't buy, and he was willing to give up everything to keep it. Chapter 3. Souls Touching in the Rain. 2 weeks into their courtship, Bernard had settled into the rhythm of being Ben, with an ease that both thrilled and terrified him. Every morning, he traded silk sheets for work boots, his penthouse view for construction sites, his world of boardrooms and power lunches for something genuine and infinitely more meaningful. Tonight, he was waiting for Angela outside the clinic, leaning against his carefully chosen pickup truck, a 2018 Ford F-150 that looked well used, but reliable, the kind of vehicle a construction foreman might drive. The autumn air carried the scent of rain and dying leaves, and storm clouds gathered overhead like dark promises. When Angela emerged from the clinic's sliding doors, Bernard's breath caught in his throat the way it did every time he saw her. She moved with that same graceful confidence, but tonight there was something different in her posture, a heaviness that spoke of a particularly difficult shift. Her scrubs were rumpled, and exhaustion shadowed her beautiful amber eyes. "Rough night?" he asked softly as she approached, noting the way she rubbed her temples. "Lost one," Angela said simply, but the weight of those 2 words hung in the air between them. 83-year-old man came in with chest pains. "We did everything we could, but..." She shrugged, trying to appear casual, but Bernard could see the grief she carried for every patient she couldn't save. Without thinking, he pulled her into his arms right there in the parking lot. She stiffened for a moment, still not entirely comfortable with physical affection, then melted against his chest with a sigh that seemed to come from her very soul. "I'm sorry," he murmured into her hair, breathing in the scent of her shampoo mixed with the antiseptic smell that always clung to her after work. "I know it doesn't make it easier, but I'm sorry." They stood like that for a long moment, Angela drawing strength from his solid presence, while Bernard memorized the feeling of holding her, the perfect way she fit against him. It was intimate in a way that had nothing to do with sexuality and everything to do with 2 souls recognizing something precious in each other. "Come on," he said finally, pulling back to look at her face. "Let me take you home." Angela nodded, too tired to argue, and they climbed into his truck just as the first fat raindrops began to splatter against the windshield. Bernard had planned to take her straight to her apartment, but as they drove through the increasingly heavy rain, Angela spoke up. "Can we just drive for a while? I'm not ready to go home yet. Too many thoughts in my head." Bernard glanced at her profile, illuminated by the dashboard lights and the occasional flash of lightning. "Of course. Anywhere in particular?" "Nowhere special, just away from here." They drove in comfortable silence through the rain-slicked streets, the storm growing stronger with each passing minute. Bernard found himself taking random turns, letting the night guide them wherever it wanted to go. Angela leaned her head against the passenger window, watching the city blur past through the rain. "Tell me about your family," she said suddenly, her voice soft in the truck's enclosed space. Bernard's hands tightened on the steering wheel. This was dangerous territory. Every detail of his fabricated past had to be perfect, consistent, believable. But more than that, he was terrified of the intimacy her question implied, the way she was slowly letting him into her guarded heart. "Not much to tell," he said carefully. "Parents died when I was 22, car accident, no siblings, just me against the world, you know." It wasn't entirely a lie. His parents had died in a car accident, though it had happened when he was 26, not 22, and he'd inherited billions rather than being left to struggle alone. But the grief in his voice was real, the old pain of losing the only people who'd ever loved him for who he was, rather than what he could provide. Angela reached over and touched his hand where it rested on the gear shift. The simple contact sent electricity shooting up his arm, but more than that, it was an offering of comfort, a gesture that said she understood loss and loneliness. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "That must have been so hard, being alone like that." "What about you?" Bernard asked, desperate to shift the focus away from his fabricated past. "Your mum, she raised you by herself after—" Angela's face darkened, and she pulled her hand back to wrap her arms around herself. "After Richard Harrington destroyed our lives? Yeah, she did her best, but—" She paused, gathering her thoughts. "He broke something in her, Ben. Something that never healed. The rain was coming down harder now, and Bernard had to slow down to navigate safely through the increasingly flooded streets. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the world in stark black and white. She loved him," Angela continued, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Really, truly loved him with everything she had. She was 19 when they met, working as a waitress to put herself through community college. He was this successful, sophisticated older man who swept her off her feet with expensive gifts and promises of a better life." Bernard felt sick, knowing men like Harrington, understanding exactly how the predatory relationship had played out. She quit school to be with him, moved into his mansion, let him pay for everything. He said he wanted to take care of her, that she didn't need to worry about anything except being beautiful and loving him. Angela's voice grew bitter. What he really wanted was a pretty accessory who would be grateful for whatever scraps of attention he threw her way. Thunder rumbled overhead, so loud it seemed to shake the truck. Bernard pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour laundromat, the only business still open on this deserted stretch of road. The neon sign flickered erratically, casting pink and blue shadows through the rain. "When she got pregnant with me, everything changed," Angela said, staring out at the storm. Suddenly she wasn't his perfect little doll anymore. She was tired, emotional, her body was changing. He started staying, out all night, bringing other women to charity galas while she waited at home with her swollen ankles and morning sickness. Bernard wanted to say something, anything, to ease the pain he heard in her voice, but he knew she needed to tell this story, needed to purge it from her system like poison from a wound. "The day I was born, he wasn't even there. He was in Monaco with his mistress, Mum spent 3 days in the hospital alone, holding me and wondering if he'd even remember he had a daughter. Angela laughed, but there was no humor in it. He came home eventually, took one look at me and said I was too dark to be his, said Mom must have been cheating. Jesus, Bernard breathed, his heart breaking for the infant Angela and the young woman who'd been so brutally abandoned. That's when he threw us out, literally. Had security escort us off the property with nothing but the clothes on our backs. Mum's name wasn't on any of the accounts, wasn't on the deed. She'd trusted him completely, and in one day we went from mansion to homeless shelter. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, and the rain began coming down in sheets so heavy that Bernard could barely see the laundromat's windows. Without discussing it, they both understood they needed to wait out the storm. "Come on," Bernard said, pulling his jacket off and holding it over both their heads. "Let's get inside before we drown." They ran through the rain, splashing through puddles and laughing, despite the heavy conversation. The laundromat was warm and bright, filled with the comfortable sounds of washing machines and dryers. An elderly man dozed in a plastic chair near the back, and a young mother folded tiny clothes, while her toddler played with colorful blocks. Bernard and Angela found an empty corner, shaking rain from their hair and clothes. Angela's scrubs were soaked through, clinging to her curves in a way that made Bernard's mouth go dry. His own flannel shirt was plastered to his chest, and he could feel Angela's eyes on him, taking in the physical evidence of the manual labor he'd been doing. "Look at us," Angela said with a rueful smile, wringing water from her hair, "wet as drowned cats." Bernard shrugged out of his jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was still damp, but it was warmer than her soaked scrubs. The gesture brought them closer together, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her amber eyes, close enough to count the raindrops clinging to her lashes. "Better?" he asked softly. Angela nodded, pulling the jacket tighter around herself. "Thank you for the jacket and for listening. I don't usually talk about all that." "Why did you tonight?" She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to read something there. "Because you feel safe," she said finally. "I know that probably sounds crazy, but there's something about you that makes me want to trust again." The words hit Bernard like a physical blow. Here she was, opening her heart to him, trusting him with her deepest pain, and he was lying to her about everything that mattered. The guilt was eating him alive, but the alternative, losing her, was unthinkable. "Angela," he started, not sure what he was going to say, but needing to say something true. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating her face in stark black and white, and suddenly the words didn't matter. What mattered was the way she was looking at him, with something that might have been love beginning to bloom in her eyes. What mattered was the way she was leaning toward him, as if drawn by the same invisible force that had been pulling them together since that first night in the clinic. "Ben," she whispered, and then his name was lost as their lips met. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, like a question neither of them was sure they should be asking. But then Angela's arms came up around his neck, and Bernard pulled her closer, and the kiss deepened into something desperate and hungry and completely consuming. She tasted like rain and hope, and something indefinably sweet, and Bernard felt like he was drowning in the best possible way. This wasn't the calculated seduction of his usual world, where every touch was a negotiation and every kiss was a transaction. This was raw and real and beautiful, Angela giving herself to him not because of what he could buy her, but because of who he was when he was with her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Angela's eyes were wide with wonder and something that might have been fear. "I don't do this," she said, her voice shaky. "I don't let people in. I don't trust. I don't—" Bernard silenced her with another kiss, this one gentle and reassuring. "Neither do I," he admitted against her lips. "But here we are." They made Love right there in the laundromat, hidden in the corner between two silent washing machines, while rain pounded against the windows and thunder shook the building. It was intense, raw, and desperate, both of them pouring months of loneliness and longing into every touch, every kiss, every whispered endearment. Angela responded to his touch with a passion that took his breath away, her body moving beneath him as if she'd been created for him alone. When she cried out his name, "Ben, oh God, Ben," Bernard felt something break open inside his chest, something that had been locked away so long he'd forgotten it existed. Afterward, they lay entwined on his jacket, Angela's head on his. Unchest, both of them listening to the storm rage outside. Her fingers traced lazy patterns on his skin, and Bernard couldn't remember ever feeling so completely at peace. "The storm's getting worse," Angela murmured, though she made no move to separate from him. "We can wait it out," Bernard said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I've got nowhere else I'd rather be." Angela lifted her head to look at him, her amber eyes serious. "Ben, what we just did, it changes things. I know. I mean, it changes everything. For me, anyway. I don't give my heart lightly." Bernard cupped, her face in his hands, memorizing every beautiful detail. "Neither do I," he said, and meant it more than any words he'd ever spoken. As they dressed slowly, reluctantly, the storm began to subside. By the time they made it back to his truck, the rain had gentled to a steady drizzle, and the worst of the thunder had moved off into the distance. But Bernard knew that the real storm was just beginning. Tonight, he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. Tonight, he'd fallen completely, irrevocably in love with a woman who trusted him with everything she had, and who had no idea that everything about him was a lie. As he drove Angela home through the quiet streets, her hand clasped in his, Bernard made a silent promise to himself and to her. Whatever it took, however long it took, he would find a way to deserve the love she was offering him. He would become the man she believed him to be, even if it meant leaving everything else behind, because losing Angela Morris was no longer an option. She had become essential to his survival, as necessary as breathing, as vital as his heartbeat. And Bernard Ellison, billionaire CEO, master of the universe, man who could buy anything he desired, had finally found something money couldn't purchase, a love worth any sacrifice. Chapter 4. Hearts on Fire. The modest apartment Bernard had hastily rented and furnished 3 weeks ago had become his sanctuary, the only place where he could truly be Ben, without the crushing weight of deception. Located in a quiet neighborhood, 15 minutes from Angela's building, it was everything his penthouse wasn't. Small, comfortable, lived-in, authentic. Tonight marked their first official date since the thunderstorm encounter in the laundromat 2 weeks ago. Bernard had spent the entire day in a state of nervous anticipation that would have amused his business associates, who'd never seen their ruthless CEO reduced to anxiety over whether he'd chosen the right wine, or if the chicken he'd marinated would be tender enough. The apartment's main room served as both living area and dining space, furnished with pieces he'd carefully selected from second-hand stores and garage sales. A worn leather couch faced a modest television, while a small dining table sat beneath the single window that looked out onto a tree-lined street. Jazz music played softly from an old radio, creating an atmosphere of intimate warmth. Bernard checked his watch, a simple Timex that had replaced his Rolex, for the 10th time. Angela would arrive any minute, bringing dinner as she'd insisted, despite his protests, that he should be the one cooking for her. The thought of her in his space, seeing where Ben supposedly lived, filled him with both excitement and terror. A soft knock at the door made his heart race. Bernard wiped his suddenly sweaty palms on his jeans, real denim he'd broken in through actual work. and opened the door to find Angela standing in the hallway with a covered dish in her hands and a smile that made his knees weak. She was stunning in a simple sundress, the color of autumn leaves, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back in her usual professional style. The golden undertones of her skin seemed to glow in the hallway's soft lighting, and her amber eyes sparkled with something that looked like anticipation mixed with nervousness. "I hope you're hungry," she said, lifting the dish. "I may have gotten a little carried away with the portions." "You didn't have to bring anything," Bernard said, stepping aside to let her in. "I told you I was cooking, and I told you I don't let other people take care of me," Angela replied with a laugh. "We can compromise. You provide the wine, I provide the food, and we both pretend we know what we're doing." As she moved into his living space, Bernard watched her take in the details of his carefully constructed life. Her eyes lingered on the mismatched furniture, the stack of construction manuals on the coffee table, the photographs he'd placed strategically around the room. Stock photos of people who were supposed to be his friends and colleagues, creating a history that didn't exist. "This is nice," Angela said, and Bernard could hear the genuine appreciation in her voice. "It feels like you, comfortable, unpretentious, real." The word real hit him like a knife to the chest, but he forced a smile. "It's not much, but it's home." Angela set her dish on the small dining table and turned to face him fully. In the soft lamplight of his living room, she looked ethereal, like something too beautiful to be real. Bernard found himself frozen, struck once again by the impossibility of what he was feeling, the way this woman had turned his carefully ordered world upside down. "Ben?" Angela said softly, noting his stillness. "Are you okay?" "Just admiring the view," he said honestly, moving toward her. Angela blushed, a rosy flush creeping up her neck that made Bernard want to trace its path with his lips. "You're making me nervous when you look at me like that." "Like what?" "Like I'm something precious. Like I'm worth looking at." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Bernard moved closer, close enough to catch the subtle scent of her perfume, close enough to see the gold flecks in her eyes. "You are worth looking at. You're worth everything." For a moment, they simply stood there, the air between them crackling with tension and possibility. Then Angela smiled, a shy, beautiful expression that made Bernard's heart stutter. "Should we eat before the food gets cold?" she asked, though neither of them moved to sit down. "In a minute," Bernard murmured, reaching up to cup her face in his. "Our hands. First, I need to do something I've been thinking about all day." He kissed her softly, a gentle brush of lips that was meant to be brief, but quickly deepened as Angela melted against him. Her hands fisted in his flannel shirt, pulling him closer, and Bernard felt that same overwhelming need he'd experienced in the laundromat, the desperate hunger to be as close to her as possible. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Angela's eyes were dark with desire. "Maybe dinner can wait," she said, her voice husky. The admission broke whatever restraint Bernard had been clinging to. He lifted her easily, carrying her to the couch while she laughed and wrapped her arms around his neck. They tumbled onto the worn leather together, hands exploring, lips meeting and parting and meeting again. "I love hearing you laugh," Bernard murmured against her throat, pressing kisses along the elegant line of her neck. "It's the most beautiful sound in the world." Angela's response was lost in a gasp as he found the sensitive spot just below her ear. Her hands roamed over his chest, fingers tracing the hard muscles he'd developed through weeks of actual physical labor. When she encountered a scar along his ribs, one of several he'd claimed came from construction accidents rather than polo. "Injuries?" She pressed gentle kisses to the mark. "Does it hurt?" she asked softly. "Not anymore," Bernard said, and it was true. Nothing hurt when she was touching him like this, with such tenderness and care. They made love on his couch with a passion that built slowly, like a fire catching hold. Angela moved beneath him with increasing confidence, her earlier shyness giving way to a desire that matched his own. Every touch was electric, every kiss a promise, every whispered endearment a gift neither of them had expected to receive. Bernard had been with other women, sophisticated, experienced women who knew exactly what they wanted and how to get it. But nothing had prepared him for Angela's honest passion, the way she gave herself completely, without artifice or calculation. When she arched beneath him, crying out his false name, Bernard felt something break open inside his chest. Afterward, they lay entwined on the narrow couch, Angela's head on his chest. Both of them, listening to the sound of each other's breathing, gradually returned to normal. The apartment was quiet except for the soft jazz still playing from the radio and the distant sounds of the city outside. "We should probably eat," Angela said eventually, though she made no move to leave his arms. "Probably," Bernard agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "But I'm not ready to let you go yet." Angela lifted her head to look at him, her amber eyes serious. "Ben, can I ask you something?" "Anything. How is it that someone like you is single? I mean, you're kind, you're handsome, you work hard." She trailed off, suddenly shy again. Bernard felt the familiar twist of guilt in his stomach. How could he explain that in his real life, relationships were transactions, that every woman who'd ever claimed to love him had been more interested in his bank account than his heart? How could he tell her that she was the first person who'd ever made him want to be better than he was? "I could ask you the same question," he said, deflecting. "Beautiful, intelligent, compassionate. How has some lucky guy not snapped you up already?" Angela's expression grew guarded, the walls she'd been slowly lowering starting to rise again. "You know why. I told you about my mother, about what happened to us. I learned early not to trust men who promise things they can't deliver." The irony of her words cut deep. Here he was, making promises with every touch, every kiss, every whispered endearment, and all of it was built on the biggest lie imaginable. "Hey," Bernard said softly, noticing the change in her mood. "What's wrong?" Angela bit her lip, clearly debating whether to voice whatever was troubling her. "It's just, this feels too good to be true. You feel too good to be true. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for you to turn out to be someone else entirely." Bernard's blood turned to ice. Did she suspect something? Had he made some mistake, left some clue that revealed his true identity? "What do you mean?" he asked carefully. "I mean that I'm falling for you," Angela said, her voice barely audible. "Really falling, in a way that terrifies me. And every time something good happens in my life, it gets taken away." The raw vulnerability in her voice made Bernard's chest ache. Without thinking, he pulled her closer, holding her tight against him, as if he could shield her from all the pain she'd experienced. "I'm not going anywhere," he said fiercely. "Whatever you're afraid of, whatever you think might go wrong, I'm not him. I'm not the man who hurt your mother. I'm not going to abandon you." Even as he said the words, Bernard knew he was making promises he might not be able to keep. The lies were getting more complex every day, the web more tangled. But looking into Angela's eyes, seeing the trust and growing love there, he couldn't bear to be the person who took it away. They eventually made it to the dining table, sharing the meal Angela had prepared while talking about everything and nothing. She told him about her patients, about the elderly woman who brought homemade cookies to her appointments, and the young father who cried when she told him his test results were normal. Bernard found himself sharing stories from the construction sites, carefully edited versions of his experiences, working alongside men who knew nothing about his real identity. As the evening wound down, they slow danced in his small living room to the soft jazz still playing on the radio. Angela fit perfectly in his arms, her head resting on his shoulder as they swayed together in the lamplight. "I should probably go," she said reluctantly. "Early shift tomorrow." "Stay," Bernard said without thinking. "Please, I'll drive you to work in the morning." Angela pulled back to look at him, searching his face. "Are you sure? I don't want to impose." "You could never impose," Bernard said honestly. "I just want to wake up with you in my arms." They made love again in his bedroom, slower this time, savoring each touch and kiss. Angela fell asleep, curled against his side, her breathing deep and peaceful. Bernard lay awake long into the night, holding her and watching the play of streetlight across her sleeping face. He was living the most beautiful lie of his life, and every day it became harder to remember why he'd started it in the first place. Angela had changed everything, not just how he saw himself, but who he wanted to be. With her, he was becoming the man he'd always hoped he could be, if only he'd been brave enough to try. But as dawn approached and Angela stirred in his arms, murmuring his false name in her sleep, Bernard was forced to confront the truth he'd been avoiding. The deeper their love grew, the more devastating the eventual revelation would be. And with every passing day, every shared secret and whispered promise, he was ensuring that when the truth finally came out, it would destroy them both. The question was no longer whether he would lose her, but whether either of them would survive. The wreckage when his beautiful lie finally crumbled into ash. Chapter 5. Meeting her heart. Sunday afternoon sunlight filtered through the narrow windows of the Morris family's small apartment, casting warm, golden rectangles across worn linoleum floors and second-hand furniture maintained with loving care despite its age. Bernard stood outside apartment 4B, holding a modest bouquet of grocery store flowers and fighting nerves he hadn't experienced since his first board meeting at 18. Meeting Angela's mother felt more significant than any multi-billion-dollar merger he'd ever negotiated. This wasn't about impressing someone with his wealth or power, neither of which officially existed in his current persona. This was about proving himself worthy of the most precious thing in Clara Morris's world, her daughter's heart. The door opened before he could knock, revealing a woman who was clearly Angela's mother, despite the 20-plus years between them. Clara Morris had the same honey-golden skin and amber eyes, though hers were shadowed with the wariness of someone who'd learned to expect disappointment. She was smaller than her daughter, more fragile-looking, but there was steel in her spine that spoke of a woman who'd survived more than her share of battles. "You must be Ben," Clara said, her voice neutral as she assessed him from head to toe. Bernard felt like he was being evaluated by a general preparing for war. "Mrs. Morris," Bernard said, offering a smile that he hoped looked genuine rather than nervous. "Thank you for inviting me. These are for you." He held out the flowers, suddenly worried they were too modest, too cheap, not enough for a woman who deserved so much more. Clara accepted the bouquet with a softness that surprised him. "Daisies," she said, bringing them to her nose. "My favorites. How did you know?" "Angela mentioned it," Bernard said, though the truth was he'd spent an hour researching Clara Morris online, learning everything he could about her preferences, her history, her struggles. The same thoroughness he applied to business deals now served to help him navigate the minefield of Angela's family dynamics. "Well, come in then," Clara said, stepping aside. "Angela's in the kitchen, pretending she's not nervous about this dinner." The apartment was tiny, a living room that doubled as dining space, a galley kitchen barely big enough for one person, and presumably a single bedroom down the narrow hallway. But it was spotlessly clean and filled with personal touches that spoke of a home rather than just a place to sleep. Family photos covered every available surface, most featuring Angela at various stages of her life, and handmade quilts draped over furniture added warmth and color to the modest space. What struck Bernard most was how different it felt from his own sterile penthouse. This place had soul, had history, had love woven into every corner, despite, or perhaps because of, its limitations. Angela appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing a simple dress that made her skin glow and her eyes sparkle. "Ben, you're early." "Traffic was lighter than I expected," Bernard said, which was true. He'd actually been driving around the neighborhood for 20 minutes, too nervous to arrive on time. Angela crossed to him, rising on her toes to press a soft kiss to his cheek. The casual intimacy of the gesture wasn't lost on Clara, whose sharp eyes missed nothing. "Dinner's almost ready," Angela said. "Mom, would you mind keeping Ben company while I finish up?" "Of course," Clara said, gesturing for Bernard to sit on the small couch. "We need to get acquainted anyway." As Angela disappeared back into the kitchen, Bernard found himself alone with the woman whose opinion could make or break his relationship, with the love of his life. Clara settled into a worn armchair across from him, her posture perfect, despite the exhaustion he could see in her eyes. "So," Clara said without preamble, "tell me about yourself, Ben. Angela says you work construction." "Yes. Ma'am, foreman at Morrison Building Company. Been there about 5 years now." The lies rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, backed up by weeks of actual experience and carefully manufactured documentation. "Hard work," Clara observed. "Good, honest work. I respect that." Bernard nodded, noting the emphasis on honest. He suspected every word he spoke was being weighed and measured against some internal standard Clara had developed over years of protecting her daughter. "Angela tells me you lost your parents young," Clara continued. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you. It was difficult. But you learned to make your own family, find people who matter." Bernard met her gaze directly. "Your daughter matters to me, Mrs. Morris, more than I know how to express." Something flickered in Clara's eyes, not quite approval, but perhaps the beginning of it. "She matters to me too. She's all I have left in this world worth fighting for." The weight of that statement settled between them. Bernard understood he was being given a warning as much as information. Hurt Angela, and he'd have Clara Morris to answer to. "Can I ask you something?" Bernard said carefully. Clara nodded. "What should I know?" "About Angela, I mean. What should I understand to love her the way she deserves?" The question seemed to surprise Clara. Her defensive posture softened slightly, and for the first time Bernard saw a glimpse of the young woman she'd once been. Hopeful, trusting, full of dreams. "She doesn't let people in easily," Clara said finally. "When she was 12, we lost everything. Not just money or possessions, but safety, security, the belief that love could be trusted." Clara's voice grew distant, lost in painful memories. "I was young and stupid, and so desperately in love, that I ignored every red flag, every warning sign. I let a man make me completely dependent on him, and when he was done with me, he threw us away like garbage." Bernard felt sick, knowing exactly who Clara was talking about, knowing the type of man Richard Harrington III was, because he moved in those same circles, knew that same casual cruelty that came with unlimited wealth and power. Angela watched. "It all," Clara continued. "Watched me fall apart, watched us lose our home, watched me cry myself to sleep in homeless shelters. She was just a baby, but she had to grow up fast, had to take care of me when I couldn't take care of myself." "I'm sorry," Bernard said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "I'm sorry that happened to both of you." Clara studied his face intently. "Are you? Or are you just saying what you think I want to hear?" The question hit like a physical blow. Bernard realized that this woman had developed razor-sharp instincts for detecting deception, for seeing through the lies that charming men told to get what they wanted. "I'm sorry, because the thought of Angela being hurt, of her watching you suffer, makes me physically ill," Bernard said honestly. "I'm sorry because you both deserve so much better. And I'm sorry because every day I see how those scars still affect her. How hard it is for her to trust, how much courage it takes for her to let anyone close." Clara was quiet for a long moment, processing his words. "She loves you," she said finally. "I can see it in the way she talks about you, the way her whole face lights up when your name comes up. I haven't seen her like this ever." The admission filled Bernard with joy and terror in equal measure. "I love her too, more than I knew it was possible to love anyone." "Love isn't enough," Clara said sharply. "The man who destroyed our lives claimed to love me too. Love without honesty, without respect, without genuine commitment is just pretty words that cause pretty pain." Before Bernard could respond, Angela appeared with a steaming casserole dish, her face flushed from the heat of the small kitchen. "I hope you like chicken and rice," she said, setting the dish on the small dining table that had been set with mismatched plates and glasses that had clearly been carefully washed and polished for the occasion. They gathered around the table, Clara offering a brief grace that Bernard respectfully bowed his head for, though his own prayers were more desperate. "Please, don't let me hurt these women. Please let me find a way to deserve their trust. Please let love be enough to overcome the lies I've built my life on." The meal was simple but delicious, clearly prepared with love and care, despite the modest ingredients. Angela had somehow transformed basic chicken and rice into something that tasted like home, like comfort, like everything Bernard's expensive restaurant meals had never been. "This is incredible," Bernard said, and meant it. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "Necessity," Angela laughed. "When you're working 3 jobs and trying to make every dollar stretch, you get creative with whatever's in the pantry." "Angela's been taking care of both of us since she was 14, Clara said with obvious pride. "Smartest, strongest person I know." Bernard watched the interplay between mother and daughter, seeing the deep love despite the obvious role reversal. Angela had been forced to become the adult in their relationship far too young, and the protective instincts he could see in her had been forged in the fires of real hardship. As dinner progressed, Clara slowly began to warm to him. She shared stories of Angela's childhood, her determination to excel in school despite their circumstances, her natural compassion for anyone in need, her fierce loyalty to the people she loved. With each anecdote, Bernard fell deeper in love with the woman sitting beside him, understanding more fully the strength and resilience that made her so extraordinary. "Remember when you were 16 and Mrs. Patterson's cat got sick?" Clara said, smiling at the memory. Angela groaned. "Mum, please don't." "She spent her entire paycheck from the diner on veterinary bills for that cat," Clara continued, ignoring her daughter's protests. "Money we needed for groceries, and she spent it on a neighbor's pet without a second thought." "The cat lived," Angela said defensively, "and Mrs. Patterson paid me back eventually." "That's who she is," Clara said, looking directly at Bernard. "She gives everything she has to help others, sometimes to her own detriment. She needs someone who will protect that generous heart, not take advantage of it." The message was clear, and Bernard nodded solemnly. "I understand." After dinner, Bernard insisted on doing the dishes, while Angela and Clara sat on the couch, looking through photo albums. He could hear their quiet conversation from the kitchen, Clara sharing embarrassing childhood stories that made Angela laugh and playfully protest. "Ben," Clara called, "come look at this." Bernard dried his hands and joined them on the couch, Angela scooting over to make room for him. The photo album was filled with pictures spanning Angela's life, school photos, graduation pictures, candid shots of her at various jobs. What struck Bernard was how few photos included Clara, as if she'd always been behind the camera, documenting her daughter's life while staying out of the frame herself. "Look at this one," Angela said, pointing to a picture of herself in scrubs, clearly taken on her first day at the clinic. "I was so nervous I threw up twice before my shift." "You never told me that," Bernard said, smiling at the image of a younger Angela trying to look confident despite her obvious anxiety. "There's a lot I haven't told you yet," Angela said, leaning against his side, "but we have time." As the evening wound down, Clara excused herself to bed, but not before pulling Bernard aside. She's been hurt enough, Clara said quietly, so Angela couldn't hear from the living room. If you're not serious about her, if this is just some kind of game to you, walk away now. Don't make her fall any deeper just to abandon her later. Mrs. Morris, Bernard said, meeting her fierce gaze, I would rather die than hurt your daughter. She's the best thing that's ever happened to me. Clara studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I believe you mean that. Just remember that meaning it and doing it are two different things. On the drive back to Angela's apartment, she was unusually quiet, staring out the passenger window at the city lights streaming past. Penny for your thoughts, Bernard said, softly. She likes you, Angela said finally. I can tell she hasn't liked anyone I've brought home since high school. She's protective of you. I respect that. Angela turned to look at him, her amber eyes serious in the dashboard light. Ben, what my mom went through, what we both went through, it changed us, made us careful, maybe too careful. But with you, I feel like maybe I can trust again. Maybe I can let someone take care of me for once, instead of always being the one who takes care of everyone else. Bernard pulled over, unable to drive, while his heart was breaking with the weight of her trust. He turned to face her fully, cupping her face in his hands. I want to take care of you, he said fiercely. I want to be the man who makes you feel safe, who proves that love can be trusted. I want to be worthy of what you're offering me. They made love that night with a tenderness that brought tears to both their eyes, Angela whispering his name like a prayer, while Bernard worshipped her body with a devotion that came from the very depths of his soul. When she fell asleep in his arms, her face peaceful and trusting, Bernard stared at the ceiling and made silent promises he prayed he'd be able to keep. But even as he held her, even as he breathed in the scent of her hair and felt the steady rhythm of her heart against his chest, Bernard knew that the foundation of their love was built on lies that grew more complex with every passing day. Meeting Clara had shown him exactly what he stood to lose, not just Angela, but the chance to be part of a real family, to belong somewhere, to matter to people who loved him for who he was, rather than what he could provide. The question that haunted him as dawn approached was whether the man he was becoming with Angela was real enough to survive the revelation of who he'd been without her, and whether love, no matter how deep or true, could bridge the chasm between the truth and the beautiful lie he'd constructed around it. Chapter 6. The Hero's Mask. The knock on Bernard's apartment door came at 7 in the morning, urgent and desperate. He'd been expecting Angela for their planned breakfast, but when he opened the door, he found her in tears, still wearing yesterday's clothes, her hair disheveled and her beautiful amber eyes red from crying. Ben, she sobbed, falling into his arms. I don't know what to do. Mrs. Washington is being evicted and I don't have enough money to help her, and she's 82 years old with nowhere to go. Bernard held her tight, his heart breaking at her distress, while his mind immediately began calculating solutions. Mrs. Washington was Angela's elderly neighbor, a sweet woman who'd lived in the apartment building for 40 years and had become like a grandmother to Angela. The thought of her being put out on the street was clearly devastating to the woman he loved. Tell me what happened, Bernard said softly, guiding Angela to his couch and pulling her down beside him. Angela took a shuddering breath, trying to compose herself. Her son was supposed to be sending money for her rent, but apparently he's been gambling it away instead. She's 3 months behind, and the landlord gave her until Friday to pay, or he's filing for eviction. That's 4 days, Ben. 4 days. To come up with $1,800, and she has maybe 50 in her checking account. Bernard's first instinct was to write a check. $1,800 was pocket change to him, less than he spent on wine at a single business dinner. But Ben, the construction worker who lived paycheck to paycheck, couldn't simply produce that kind of money without raising questions. What about her family? Anyone else who could help? Her son is the only family she has left, and he won't even return her calls, Angela said bitterly. She's too proud to ask for help anyway. I only found out because I heard her crying through the walls last night. Bernard pulled Angela closer, his mind racing through possibilities. He needed to help Mrs. Washington. There was no question about that. But he had to do it in a way that didn't expose his true identity. An idea began to form, risky but possible. What if we organized a community fundraiser, he suggested. Get the whole building involved, maybe some of the neighbors from nearby apartments. People around here look out for each other, right? Angela lifted her head to look at him, hope flickering in her eyes. You think we could raise that much? We won't know until we try, Bernard said, already mentally planning how to make it work. I've got connections from work, guys who might be willing to donate. And you know everyone in the building, everyone at the clinic. If we work together, we might be able to pull it off. The transformation in Angela's face was beautiful to watch. The despair lifted, replaced by determination and the fierce protectiveness. He'd come to adore about her. Yes, she said, sitting up straighter. Yes, we can do this. Mrs. Washington has helped so many people over the years, watching kids after school, cooking for people when they were sick, lending money she didn't have when someone needed it. Now it's our turn to help her. They spent the rest of the morning going door to door in Angela's building, explaining the situation and asking for whatever people could spare. Bernard was amazed by the response. Even people who clearly had very little were willing to contribute something. A single mother gave $20 she probably needed for groceries. An elderly man on disability donated $50 and promised to ask his poker buddies to chip in. A young couple expecting their first baby contributed $30 and offered to make flyers. By noon, they'd collected nearly $400 in cash and pledges, but it wasn't nearly enough. Angela's optimism was beginning to fade as the reality of their shortfall became apparent. It's not going to be enough, she said, as they sat on the building's front steps, counting the money for the third time. We're barely a quarter of the way there. Don't give up yet, Bernard said, pulling out his phone. Let me make some calls. He stepped away from Angela and dialed the number for one of his shell companies, one that handled charitable donations and community outreach. Speaking in code that his assistant would understand, he arranged for anonymous donations totaling $800 to be delivered to his apartment that afternoon, supposedly from his construction crew and friends from work. The lie made him sick, but watching Angela's face light up when he returned with the news that his co-workers had come through with generous donations made it almost bearable. $800? Angela said incredulously. Ben, that's incredible. Your friends at work barely know Mrs. Washington. They know she matters to you, and you matter to me, Bernard said, which was at least partially true. Good people help good people. By evening, they'd reached their goal and then some. Bernard had orchestrated several more anonymous donations through various channels, creating a paper trail that would satisfy anyone who looked into it while ensuring Mrs. Washington had not just her back rent, but several months of future payments covered. The celebration in the building's small courtyard that night was unlike anything Bernard had ever experienced. Mrs. Washington wept as the residents presented her with the money, thanking everyone through her tears while Angela held her hand. The elderly woman kept looking at Ben with such gratitude that he felt like the worst kind of fraud. I don't know how to thank you, young man, Mrs. Washington said, gripping Bernard's hands with surprising strength. Angela told me this was your idea, that you organized everything. It was a community effort, Bernard said, uncomfortable with the praise. Everyone contributed. But you led it, Mrs. Washington insisted. You saw someone in need, and you did something about it. That's the mark of a good man. As the impromptu party continued around them, Angela pulled Bernard aside, her eyes shining with something that looked like pure adoration. You have the most beautiful heart, she said, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. Watching you. Today, seeing how you brought everyone together, how you cared about Mrs. Washington even though you barely know her. I've never loved anyone the way I love you. The words hit Bernard like a physical blow. She'd said she loved him, actually. Said the words he'd been desperately hoping to hear. But instead of joy, he felt only crushing guilt and the terrible knowledge that her love was based on a lie. Angela, he started, but she silenced him with a kiss that tasted like promises and forever. Later that night, on Angela's fire escape, overlooking the courtyard where their neighbors were still celebrating, they made love under a canopy of stars with an intensity that left them both breathless and shaking. Angela moved above him with worship-like devotion, her hands tracing every line of his face as if memorizing him. "I love you," she whispered against his lips as they moved together. "I love your kindness, your strength, the way you see people who need help and actually do something about it. I love how you make me believe in good men again." Bernard responded by flipping them over, making love to her with a desperation born of knowing he didn't deserve the woman writhing beneath him, crying out his false name like a prayer. Every touch was worship, every kiss a silent apology for the lies that were eating him alive from the inside. "I love you too," he gasped as they reached their peak together. "God, Angela, I love you so much it terrifies me." Afterward, as they lay tangled together on the narrow fire escape, Angela traced lazy patterns on his chest while the sounds of the neighborhood settled into evening quiet. "Ben," she said softly, "what you did today, it showed me who you really are. You didn't have to care about Mrs. Washington. You didn't have to spend your whole day organizing a fundraiser for someone else's problem. But you did it because you saw someone hurting and you couldn't stand it." Bernard closed his eyes, her words like knives in his chest. She thought she'd seen who he really was, but she'd only seen the man he wished he could be. The irony was devastating. By helping Mrs. Washington, he'd become more himself than he'd ever been in his old life. But it was all built on deception. "That's who I want to be," he said honestly. "With you, I want to be the kind of man who makes a difference." "You already are," Angela said, pressing a kiss to his chest. "Today proved it." As Angela drifted off to sleep in his arms, Bernard stared up at the stars and confronted the truth he'd been avoiding. He wasn't just pretending to be poor anymore. He was discovering who he could be without the barriers of wealth and power, learning what it meant to be part of a community that looked out for each other. The problem was that this version of himself, the man Angela had fallen in love with, couldn't exist without the resources of the man he really was. Every act of heroism, every moment of generosity, was funded by the very wealth he was hiding from her. He was caught in an impossible paradox, becoming his best self through the worst possible deception. Over the following days, Bernard found himself doing more community work, using his vast resources to anonymously fund everything from scholarship, programs to medical bill assistance, all while maintaining his cover as a hard-working construction foreman. He was living a double life that was simultaneously the most honest and most dishonest thing he'd ever done. Angela watched it all with growing admiration, seeing in him the kind of man she'd never believed could exist. Someone with the compassion to care and the follow-through to act. She began talking about their future together, about the things they could accomplish as a team, about the clinic she wanted to open and how he could help her make it a reality. Each conversation was another weight added to Bernard's conscience. She was building dreams around a man who didn't really exist, making plans with someone whose entire identity was a carefully constructed lie. But the alternative, losing her, had become unthinkable. The hero mask he wore was becoming more comfortable every day, more real than the billionaire persona he'd abandoned. But masks, no matter how well crafted, eventually had to come off. And when that happened, Bernard was beginning to understand that the man underneath might not be enough to salvage what he'd built with Angela. Still, as he watched her sleep in, his arms under the stars, her face peaceful and trusting, Bernard made a silent vow. Whatever it cost him, whatever he had to sacrifice, he would find a way to become worthy of her love. He would make the hero mask real, even if it meant destroying everything else he'd ever been, because Angela Morris had shown him who he could be, and he'd rather die than disappoint her. Chapter 7. Promises Written in Stars. 3 months into their relationship, Bernard had mastered the art of living 2 lives. By day, he was Ben the construction foreman, his hands genuinely calloused from weeks of authentic labor, his body lean and strong from physical work he'd never imagined doing. By night, he secretly orchestrated a shadow campaign of anonymous generosity throughout Angela's neighborhood, using shell companies and carefully structured donations to improve lives while maintaining his cover. Tonight was different. Tonight, he had something special planned that would require all of his considerable resources and creativity to pull off while staying in character. He'd been planning this evening for weeks, driven by a need to give Angela something beautiful, something that showed her how much she meant to him without revealing the truth about his wealth. The text he'd sent her that afternoon was deliberately mysterious. "Meet me at 8 p.m. at the construction site on 5th and Morrison. Trust me." Now, as Bernard stood on the rooftop of the unfinished building that his company was secretly developing, he surveyed his handiwork with nervous pride. He'd spent the afternoon transforming the concrete space into something magical. Hundreds of battery-powered candles created a warm, flickering glow that competed with the city lights spread out below them. Rose petals, real ones, not the artificial nonsense his old life would have demanded, were scattered across a thick blanket that served as their dining area. A camping stove sat ready beside carefully prepared ingredients, everything chosen to suggest a man who'd saved up for something special rather than someone who could afford the finest restaurants in the city. The view was spectacular, 30 floors above the city, with downtown's glittering skyline stretched out before them like a field of stars brought down to earth. Bernard had gotten permission from his construction boss to use the space, a story that would hold up because he technically was the boss, even if Angela didn't know it. His phone buzzed with a text from Angela. "Outside the building." "Where?" "Are you?" "Service elevator, top floor. I'll meet you at the elevator doors," he typed back, his heart racing with anticipation and terror. Everything had to be perfect. This woman deserved perfect. When the elevator doors opened and Angela stepped onto the rooftop, Bernard forgot how to breathe. She was wearing a simple sundress that moved like silk in the evening breeze, her hair loose around her shoulders, catching the candlelight like spun gold. But it was her expression that stopped his heart, wonder and delight mixing with something deeper, warmer, that looked like pure love. "Ben," she breathed, taking in the transformed rooftop. "What is all this?" "Dinner with a view," Bernard said, trying to sound casual despite the nervous energy coursing through his veins. "I thought you might like something different." Angela moved slowly through the candles, her fingers trailing over the rose petals, her eyes wide with amazement. "How did you... this must have cost..." "It didn't cost much," Bernard lied, smoothly. "The candles are battery-powered, borrowed them from work. The roses are from Mrs. Chen's garden downstairs. She insisted I take some when I told her I was planning something special. And the food..." He gestured toward the camping stove. "Well, let's just say I've been practicing." It was a carefully constructed story that painted him as resourceful rather than wealthy, thoughtful rather than extravagant. But watching Angela's face as she absorbed the romantic scene he'd created, Bernard knew the lies were worth it. She looked at him like, He'd given her the moon and stars instead of a rooftop picnic. "This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever done for me," Angela said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Ben, how did you even think of this?" "You mentioned once that you'd never seen the city from up high," Bernard said, moving to stand beside her at the rooftop's edge. "And I wanted to give you something special, something that was just ours." They stood together looking out over the city, Angela leaning back against his chest, while his arms wrapped around her waist. The evening air was perfect, warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze that carried the sounds of the city up to their private paradise. "It's incredible," Angela murmured. "I never imagined it could be so beautiful from up here. It looks like the whole world is covered in diamonds." Bernard pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. "Not as beautiful as you." Angela turned in his arms, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "How are you real? How is any of this real?" The question hit closer to home than she could possibly know. Bernard silenced her with a kiss that was gentle at first, then deeper as she melted against him. Up here, surrounded by candlelight and rose petals with the city spread out below them, it was easy to forget that their entire relationship was built on lies. It was easy to believe that this was real, that they were real, that love could conquer anything. "Come on," Bernard said, when they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily. "Let me cook for you." The meal was simple but perfect. Grilled chicken with herbs, roasted vegetables, and a pasta salad he'd actually learned to make during his weeks of playing the part of Ben. He cooked on the camping stove while Angela watched, asking questions about his technique and laughing when he admitted he'd burned the first batch of chicken while practicing. "You practiced?" Angela asked, delighted. "You actually practiced cooking for me." "I wanted it to be perfect," Bernard admitted, which was completely true. "You deserve perfect." They ate sitting on the blanket, feeding each other bites and talking about everything and nothing. Angela told him about her day at the clinic, about the young mother who'd brought her baby in for a checkup and ended up crying about her own postpartum depression. Bernard found himself sharing stories from the construction site, carefully edited versions of his experiences, working alongside men who had no idea their temporary co-worker was worth more than their combined annual salaries. As the evening progressed and the candles burned lower, they slow danced to music from Bernard's phone, moving together on the rooftop like they were the only two people in the world. Angela fit perfectly in his arms, her head resting on his shoulder as they swayed to the soft jazz that had become their song. "Ben," Angela said softly, pulling back to look at him, "I need to tell you something." Bernard's heart stopped. Had she figured it out? Had he made some mistake, left some clue that revealed his true identity? "What is it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Angela reached into her small purse and pulled out a simple silver band, nothing fancy or expensive, just a plain ring that caught the candlelight. "I bought this with my tip money from the diner. It's not much, and I know it's not traditional for the woman to give the man a ring, but—" She was nervous, Bernard realized with wonder. This strong, confident woman was actually nervous about giving him a gift. "It's a promise ring," Angela continued, her words coming faster as her nervousness grew. "A promise that someday, when we can afford it, when we've saved up enough, maybe we could think about getting married. If you want to, I mean, if you think we could have a future together." Bernard stared at the simple silver band, his vision blurring with tears he didn't even realize were falling. This woman who worked 3 jobs just to pay her bills, who counted every penny and saved every dollar, had spent her hard-earned tip money on a ring for him. She was offering him forever, offering him her whole heart, and she had no idea that he could buy her a diamond ring worth more than she'd make in a decade. "Angela," he whispered, his voice breaking. You don't have to answer now, Angela said quickly, misinterpreting his emotional response. I know it's a big step, and maybe I'm moving too fast, but I love you so much, Ben. I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love someone, and I want to build a life with you. I want to have your children and grow old with you. And Bernard silenced her with a kiss that was desperate and passionate and full of every emotion he couldn't put into words. When they broke apart, he was crying openly, and Angela looked confused and worried. Yes, he said fiercely. Yes to all of it. Yes to forever. Yes to marriage. Yes to children. Yes to growing old together. Yes to everything you're offering me, because you're offering me a life I never knew I wanted. Until I met you. Angela's face lit up with joy as she slipped the ring onto his finger. It was too small for his ring finger, so she put it on his pinky, laughing through her own tears. It fits, she said with wonder. It actually fits. It's perfect, Bernard said, looking down at the simple band that meant more to him than every expensive piece of jewelry he'd ever owned. You're perfect. They made love under the stars with a passion that bordered on desperate, both of them, crying with the intensity of their connection. Bernard worshipped Angela's body with his hands and mouth, memorizing every curve, every sensitive spot, every sound she made when he touched her just right, when she moved above him, silhouetted. Against the star-filled sky, he thought he might die from the sheer beauty of it. I love you, Angela gasped as they moved together, her hands braced on his chest, her hair falling around them like a curtain. I love you so much it feels like my heart might burst. I love you too, Bernard replied, pulling her down for a kiss that tasted like promises and forever. I love you more than life itself. Afterward, they lay tangled together on the blanket, both covered in rose petals, watching the stars wheel overhead. Angela traced patterns on Bernard's chest while he played with her hair, both of them basking in the afterglow of perfect love. Ben, Angela said softly, promise me something. Anything. Promise me that no matter what happens, no matter what challenges we face, we'll always be honest with each other. No secrets, no lies, just truth between us. Bernard's heart shattered. Here she was, asking for the one thing he couldn't give her, the one promise he'd already broken beyond repair. I promise, he lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. No secrets, no lies, just truth. Angela smiled and kissed him softly, satisfied with his promise, not knowing that he was already drowning in deception. As she drifted off to sleep, in his arms, Bernard stared up at the stars and tried to figure out how he was going to keep the promises he'd just made. The ring on his pinky felt like both a blessing and a curse. It represented everything he'd ever wanted. Real love, genuine connection, a future with the woman of his dreams. But it also represented the enormous lie he was living, the web of deception that grew more complex every day. Looking at Angela's peaceful face in the candlelight, Bernard made a decision. Somehow, some way, he would find a way to make this real. He would find a way to tell her the truth without losing her, to bridge the gap between Ben and Bernard, to become worthy of the love she was offering him, because the alternative, losing her Joe, was no longer an option. She had become essential to his existence, as necessary as breathing, as vital as his heartbeat, and he would do whatever it took to keep her, even if it meant tearing his whole world apart and rebuilding it from scratch. The promises written in the stars that night were more than romantic vows between lovers. They were declarations of war against the circumstances that kept them apart, against the lies that threatened to destroy them, against anyone or anything that would try to take away what they'd found together. Bernard just prayed that when the truth finally came out, and he knew it would because lies this big always did, the love they'd built would be strong enough to survive the wreckage. Chapter 8. When Heaven Becomes Hell. For 2 weeks after their rooftop promises, Angela floated through her days in a bubble of pure happiness. The simple silver ring Bernard wore on his pinky had become her favorite sight, a constant reminder that someone loved her enough to promise forever. She found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, still amazed that someone so kind, so genuine, so perfectly imperfect could actually be hers. Which was why, on that beautiful Tuesday morning in October, she decided to surprise him with lunch at his construction site. Angela had gotten off her morning shift at the clinic early and spent an hour preparing Ben's favorite meal, the chicken and rice dish she'd made the night he met her mother, packed in a thermal container to keep it warm. She'd even bought a small bouquet of daisies from the corner store, knowing how much he loved simple, genuine gestures over expensive displays. The Morrison Building Company construction site was bustling with activity when she arrived. Workers, in hard hats, moving with purpose around the skeletal frame of what would eventually be luxury condos. Angela approached the site office, her heart fluttering with excitement at the thought of seeing Ben's face when she surprised him. "Excuse me," she said to a burly man who appeared to be in charge. "I'm looking for Ben Ellison. He's the foreman." "Here?" The man looked confused. "Ben Ellison? Lady, I've been working this site for 6 months. There's no Ben Ellison here. You sure you got the right construction company?" Angela's smile faltered. "Morrison Building Company, right? Ben said he's been working here for 5 years. Medium height, brown hair, really kind eyes." "Sorry, sweetheart. No one by that description works here. You might want to check the office down the street. Sometimes people get the companies mixed up." A cold dread began to settle in Angela's stomach as she walked away from the construction site. There had to be an explanation. Maybe Ben worked at a different site, maybe he'd changed companies recently and forgotten to mention it maybe, but even as she tried to rationalize it, Angela knew something was terribly wrong. Ben was meticulous about details, especially about his work. He wouldn't make a mistake about something so basic. Fighting back panic, Angela decided to wait and observe. Ben had said he got off work at 5. She would wait and see if he showed up. She positioned herself at a coffee shop across the street with a clear view of the construction site, nursing a cup of coffee that grew cold while she watched for any sign of the man she loved. By 6 o'clock, Angela's denial crumbled into sick certainty. Ben wasn't coming because Ben didn't work there. Ben had lied about his job, which meant he'd probably lied about everything else. The realization made her physically ill, memories of her mother's warnings echoing in her head. Rich men lie, Angela. They lie as easily as breathing, and they're so good at it that you believe them even when part of you knows better. With shaking hands, Angela pulled out her phone and did something she should have done months ago. She Googled Ben Ellison. The search results were sparse, mostly social media profiles of people who clearly weren't her Ben. But when she searched Bernard Ellison, the world tilted sideways. Headlines screamed from her phone screen. Billionaire CEO Bernard Ellison announces new development project. Ellison Industries reports record quarterly profits. Bachelor billionaire Bernard Ellison, America's most eligible single man. And there, in a professional headshot accompanying a Forbes article about America's youngest billionaires, was Ben, her Ben. Wearing a suit that probably cost more than she made in 6 months, his hair perfectly styled, his smile confident and commanding in a way she'd never seen before. Angela read the article with growing horror, each detail another knife to her heart. Bernard Ellison, CEO of Ellison Industries. Net worth, $2.3 billion. Heir to one of America's largest fortunes. Owner of properties in New York, Los Angeles, and Miami. Recently purchased Morrison Building Company as part of his real estate expansion. Morrison Building Company. The company where Ben supposedly worked as a foreman. The company that Bernard Ellison owned. Angela's hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold her phone. Everything was a lie. Everything. His job, his apartment, his struggles with money, his understanding of what it meant to live paycheck to paycheck. All of it was an elaborate fiction designed to deceive her. But why? What could a billionaire possibly want from a nurse who worked 3 jobs just to pay her bills? The answer came to her with devastating clarity: entertainment. She was a game to him, a challenge, a way for a bored rich man to amuse himself by seeing if he could seduce someone who claimed to hate everything he represented, just like her mother and Richard Harrington III. The parallel was so perfect it took her breath away. Her mother, the working-class woman seduced by a wealthy man's lies. The promises, the declarations of love, the careful manipulation designed to make her believe she was special, that she was different, that she was loved for who she was, rather than what she could provide. Angela stumbled out of the coffee shop and somehow made it to her car before breaking down completely. She sobbed until her chest ached, until she had no tears left, until the pain transformed into something harder and more dangerous: rage. She was going to confront him. She was going to look Bernard Ellison in the eye and let him know exactly what she thought of his little game. But first, she needed to see the extent of his deception for herself. The drive to downtown took 45 minutes, during which Angela's shock gave way to a cold, burning anger that felt like swallowing acid. By the time she pulled up in front of the gleaming glass tower that housed Ellison Industries, she was operating on pure fury. The building was everything she'd expected: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, the kind of ostentatious wealth that screamed power and privilege. Angela felt underdressed in her simple nurse's uniform, but she held her head high as she approached the reception desk. "I'm here to see Bernard Ellison," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. The receptionist looked her up and down with barely concealed disdain. "Do you have an appointment? Tell him Angela Morris is here to see him. He'll want to see me." After a whispered phone call, the receptionist's attitude changed to professional courtesy. "Mr. Ellison will see you now, 38th floor, corner office." The elevator ride felt like ascending to her own execution. Angela watched the numbers climb, each floor taking her further from the world she knew and deeper into the realm of wealth and power that had destroyed her family once before. The elevator opened onto a reception area that probably cost more than most people's houses. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city, and Angela realized with sick irony that she was looking down on the neighborhood where she lived, where Ben had pretended to struggle alongside her. "Ms. Morris," a perfectly groomed assistant appeared. "Mr. Ellison is waiting for you." The corner office was obscenely large, dominated by a massive desk and surrounded by windows that made the city look like a toy set. And there, standing with his back to her looking out at his empire, was the man she'd thought she knew. "Hello, Angela," Bernard said without turning around. His voice was different, more polished, more controlled, lacking the warmth and slight roughness she'd come to love. When he finally turned to face her, Angela saw a stranger wearing her beloved's face. Gone was Ben, the construction worker. In his place stood Bernard Ellison, billionaire CEO, wearing a suit that cost more than her rent, his hair perfectly styled, his posture radiating the kind of confidence that only came from having unlimited power. "You lied to me," Angela said, her voice barely above a whisper, "about everything." "Angela, let me explain." "Explain what?" The words exploded out of her with all the force of her shattered heart. "Explain how you've been playing games with my life. Explain how you thought it would be amusing to see if you could fool the poor little nurse into falling in love with a construction worker." "It wasn't like that," Bernard said, moving toward her with his hands raised as if approaching a wounded animal. "I never meant for it to go this far. I never meant to fall in love with you." "Fall in love with me?" Angela laughed, but there was no humor in it, only pain so deep it felt like dying. You don't even know me. You fell in love with the idea of slumming it with someone beneath your station. You fell in love with your own performance. That's not true, Bernard said desperately. What we have is real, Angela. My feelings for you are real. Real. Angela pulled the promise ring from her purse. The simple silver band she'd bought with her tip money, the symbol of everything she'd thought they were building together. This ring cost me 3 weeks of tips. 3 weeks of 12-hour shifts, of smiling at customers who treated me like garbage, of walking to work because I couldn't afford gas. And you probably spend more than that on a single lunch. She threw the ring at him, watching it bounce off his expensive suit and fall to the marble floor with a tiny, meaningless sound. You want to know what's real? Angela continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. What's real is that you're exactly like him, exactly like Richard Harrington III, the man who destroyed my mother's life. You're the same kind of predator who gets off on making poor women believe they're special, that they're loved, that they matter. I'm nothing like him, Bernard said, his face pale. Angela, please, you have to listen to me. No, I don't, Angela shot back. I don't have to listen to another word from your lying mouth. You want to know the really funny part? I actually believed you understood me. I thought you got what it was like to struggle, to worry about money, to work hard for everything you have. But you were just playing dress-up, weren't you? Playing poor, like it's some kind of costume you can take off when you get bored. Everything I felt for you was real, Bernard said, his voice breaking. Every moment we spent together, every time I told you I loved you. Stop, Angela whispered, pressing her hands to her ears. Just stop. I can't bear to hear any more. Lies! She turned toward the door, needing to escape before she broke down completely in front of him. But Bernard's voice stopped her. Angela, wait, please, give me a chance to make this right. She turned back to look at him one last time. This man who had been everything to her just an hour ago. Now he looked like what he'd always been, a stranger wearing the face of her dreams. Make it right? Angela's voice was quiet, deadly. You want to make it right? Then go back to your world of private jets and board meetings and leave people. Like me alone. Stop playing games with hearts you don't understand and lives you'll never have to live. She paused at the door, needing to say one more thing, needing to make sure he understood exactly what he'd done to her. You know what the worst part is, Bernard? It's not that you lied to me about who you are. It's that you made me believe in love again. You made me think that maybe my mother was wrong, that maybe there were good men in the world who could love someone for who they are instead of what they can provide. You gave me hope, and then you crushed it. Angela's voice broke. On the last words, tears finally spilling over, despite her determination not to cry in front of him. I hope your money keeps you warm at night, she said, her voice barely audible, because love never will again. She walked out of his office, out of his building, out of his life, leaving Bernard standing alone among the ruins of everything that had ever meant anything to him. The promise ring lay forgotten on the marble floor, a tiny circle of silver that had once represented forever, but now looked as meaningless as everything else in his expensively empty world. As Angela drove home through the city streets, she felt like she was dying from the inside out. The man she'd loved didn't exist. Ben had never existed. He was just a character Bernard Ellison had played, a role he'd performed so convincingly that she'd given him her whole heart. And now she had to figure out how to live with the pieces of what was left. Chapter 9. Beautiful Destruction. The first month after Angela walked out of his life, Bernard existed in a haze of whiskey and self-loathing that alarmed even his most hardened business associates. The man who had once commanded boardrooms, with surgical precision now sat through meetings in expensive suits that hung loose on his rapidly shrinking frame, his eyes hollow and unfocused, making reckless decisions. His penthouse apartment became a monument to his destruction. Empty bottles of premium scotch lined the kitchen counter like soldiers of his despair. He hadn't shaved in weeks, hadn't eaten a proper meal since the day Angela threw her promise ring at his feet and walked out forever. The ring. Bernard kept it in his jacket pocket now. The simple silver band that had cost her 3 weeks of tips but meant more to him than every expensive piece of jewelry he'd ever owned. He would take it out during business meetings, turning it over in his fingers while lawyers droned on about contracts, remembering the way Angela's face had glowed when she'd slipped it onto his finger under the stars. His assistant, Margaret, had stopped trying to manage his schedule. Half the time he didn't show up anyway, and when he did, he was usually drunk enough that she had to make excuses about his illness. The board was beginning to murmur about his fitness to lead the company, but Bernard couldn't bring himself to care. What was the point of an empire if you had no one to share it with? 3 weeks into his descent, Bernard made a decision that would have shocked his former self. If he couldn't have Angela's love, he could at least give her the dreams she'd shared with him during those precious months when she'd thought he was Ben. The Morris Community Health Clinic became his obsession. Working through shell companies and charitable foundations, Bernard poured millions into the project, ensuring the funding couldn't be traced back to him. He hired the finest architects, the most skilled construction teams, the most advanced medical equipment manufacturers. What Angela had described as a simple free clinic became a state-of-the-art medical facility that would rival the city's best hospitals. He worked on it 18 hours a day, driven by manic energy born of grief and desperation. Every detail had to be perfect. Every piece of equipment the best available. Every room designed with Angela's vision in mind. If he couldn't give her his love, he would give her this, the manifestation of every dream she'd shared with him. But even as he built her dream clinic, Bernard knew he was also building his own destruction. The deeper he poured himself into the project, the more he relived every conversation they'd had about it, every time her eyes had lit up when she talked about helping her community. Meanwhile, across the city, in her tiny apartment, Angela was fighting her own battle with the wreckage of their love. The first weeks after the confrontation had been the worst. She'd barely been able to function, calling in sick more often than she showed up, crying until her eyes were so swollen she looked like she'd been in a fight. Food became her enemy. Everything tasted like ash, and swallowing felt insurmountable. She lost weight rapidly, her scrubs hanging loose on her shrinking frame, her cheekbones becoming sharp angles in a face that had once been soft and full of life. Her mother, Clara, watched helplessly as her daughter wasted away from heartbreak. She'd seen Angela hurt before, disappointed by jobs, frustrated by financial struggles, exhausted by the constant battle to make ends meet. But she'd never seen her daughter broken like this, hollowed out by pain so deep it seemed to consume her from the inside. "You have to eat something, baby," Clara would plead, sitting beside Angela's bed with bowls of soup that went untouched. "You can't keep doing this to yourself." But Angela couldn't explain that eating felt like betrayal somehow, like accepting that life would go on when everything that had given her life meaning was gone. Bernard, had been more than just her boyfriend. He'd been her future, her hope, her proof that love could be trusted after all. Without him, she felt like she was drowning in a world that had suddenly lost all color. The nights were the worst. Angela would lie in her bed, staring at the ceiling and reliving every moment of their relationship, trying to figure out what had been real and what had been performance. Had he really loved her, or was she just another conquest for a bored billionaire? The questions ate at her like acid, corroding her ability to trust her own memories, her own heart, her own judgment. 6 weeks after their confrontation, Angela forced herself back to work at the clinic. She moved through her shifts like a ghost, performing her duties with mechanical precision, but without the warmth and compassion that had once made her patients light up when they saw her. It was during one of these shifts that Angela first heard about the clinic. "Did you hear about the new medical facility they're building over on Morrison Street?" one of the other nurses mentioned during lunch. "Supposedly it's going to be completely free for neighborhood residents. State-of-the-art equipment, full range of services." Angela looked up from the sandwich she'd been pretending to eat. "Free? That's impossible. The startup costs alone would be millions." "That's what I thought too, but apparently some anonymous donor is funding the whole thing. They're calling it the Morris Community Health Clinic." The name hit Angela like a physical blow. Morris, her name. The dream she'd shared with Bernard during those precious nights when she'd believed he understood. Her passion for helping people. "Morris Community Health Clinic?" Angela repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, construction started about a month ago. Can you imagine? A completely free clinic with the best equipment money can buy, right here in our neighborhood?" Angela excused herself and walked to the bathroom on unsteady legs, locking the door before collapsing against it. A month ago, construction had started right around the time she'd discovered Bernard's lies and walked out of his life, the Morris Community Health Clinic. Her dream clinic bearing her name, funded by an anonymous donor who had to be Bernard. That night, Angela couldn't resist driving past the construction site. What she saw took her breath away. This wasn't the modest free clinic she'd envisioned. This was a medical facility that would rival the best private hospitals. 3 stories of gleaming glass and steel, with construction crews working around. The clock, a sign posted outside, listed the features: full diagnostic imaging suite, including MRI and CT scanners, cardiac catheterization lab, surgical suites, pediatric and obstetric wings, dental clinic, mental health services, pharmacy, all services provided free of charge to community residents. Angela read the list through tears she didn't realize were falling. This was everything she'd ever dreamed of and more. A comprehensive medical facility that would transform healthcare for everyone in the neighborhood. The kind of place where Mrs. Rodriguez wouldn't have to ration her insulin, where little Tommy Chen's parents could afford his asthma treatments. But instead of joy, Angela felt only deeper, more complex pain. Because she understood what Bernard was doing. He was trying to prove his love through the one thing he knew would matter to her. And the terrible truth was that it was working, at least partially. Standing there in the cold October night, looking at the physical manifestation of every dream she'd shared with the man she'd loved, Angela began to understand the depth of what they'd lost. This clinic represented more than just Bernard's wealth. It represented his understanding of who she was, what mattered to her, what would make her happy. Over the following weeks, Angela found herself driving past the construction site regularly, watching the building take shape. The clinic wasn't the only mysterious development in the neighborhood. Suddenly, there were scholarship programs appearing for local high school students, medical bill assistance funds for families in crisis, grants for small businesses. Someone with vast resources was quietly transforming the entire community, and Angela began to understand something that made her heart ache. Bernard hadn't just been pretending to care about her neighborhood. Somehow, through their relationship, he'd genuinely come to understand what mattered to her, and he was acting on that understanding even after she'd rejected him. 3 months after their breakup, Angela's mother had a heart attack. Clara collapsed. At work, clutching her chest as pain radiated down her left arm. She was rushed to the private cardiac center across town that had the best heart specialists in the city. Angela arrived to find her mother already in surgery, having received immediate comprehensive care that their insurance should never have covered. The cardiac surgeon who met with her afterward was one of the most renowned in the country. "Your mother is very lucky," the surgeon told Angela. "We were able to clear the blockage and insert 3 stents. She should make a full recovery, but she'll need ongoing cardiac rehabilitation." "Doctor," Angela said carefully, "I need to ask about the cost. Our insurance has very limited coverage for this kind of procedure." The surgeon looked confused. "There's no cost to you, Ms. Morris. Everything is covered by a medical assistance fund that was established specifically for cases like your mother's. All her future cardiac care will be covered as well." Angela felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She knew, with absolute certainty, who had established that medical assistance fund. That night, sitting beside her mother's hospital bed and watching the monitors that showed Clara's strong, steady heartbeat, Angela finally allowed herself to confront the truth she'd been avoiding for months. Bernard Ellison had hurt her terribly by lying about who he was, but everything he'd done since she'd walked out of his life suggested that his love for her had been real, even if his identity hadn't been. He was using his vast wealth not to win her back. He had to know she'd never accept him again, but to take care of the people and community she loved. It was the most beautiful and heartbreaking gesture she'd ever witnessed, and it made her miss him with an intensity that felt like dying all over again, because for the first time since that terrible day in his office, Angela began to wonder, what if she'd been wrong? What if his love had been real, even though his name and job had been fake? What if he'd lied about everything except the one thing that mattered most? The thought terrified her, because if she was wrong about that, then she'd thrown away the greatest love of her life over pride and fear. And if she was right, then she was in love with a man who would never exist again. Either way, she was lost. And for the first time in months, Angela began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, being lost together might be better than being lost alone. Chapter 10. Love Conquers All. The Most Beautiful Reunion. 8 months had passed since Angela Morris walked out of Bernard Ellison's life, and the Morris Community Health Clinic was now the crown jewel of the neighborhood. Every day, Angela worked in the gleaming halls of her materialized dreams, surrounded by advanced medical equipment, treating patients who no longer had to choose between healthcare and rent. But every miracle she witnessed reminded her of the man who had made it all possible. The man she'd loved as Ben, lost as Bernard, and still missed with an ache that time had deepened rather than healed. Her mother's recovery had been complete, thanks to ongoing cardiac care mysteriously covered by medical assistance funds. Clara was stronger now, having watched her daughter slowly rebuild after devastating heartbreak. It was Clara who finally spoke the words Angela had been thinking but couldn't say. "He still loves you," Clara said one evening as they sat in their small apartment. "Everything he's done, the clinic, the scholarship programs, my medical care, it's not charity, baby girl. It's love, the kind of love that moves mountains." Angela looked up, tears threatening. "Mama, please. That man loves you with a love that doesn't quit even when it's rejected. Money didn't make him do all this. Love did." That night, Angela couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Bernard, wondering where he was, how he was doing, whether he was suffering the way she had been. She thought about the last time she'd seen him, standing in his expensive office looking devastated as she threw her promise ring at his feet. The promise ring. She still had it, though she'd never admitted that to anyone. It lived in her jewelry box now, a simple silver band that had once meant everything and somehow still did. The next evening, as the sun began to set, Angela made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her. She was going to find Bernard. She had to see him, had to look into his eyes and find out if there was anything left to salvage from their love. Angela drove to the rooftop where they'd made their promises under the stars 8 months ago. Something told her that if Bernard was thinking about her the way she'd been thinking about him, he would be there. The building was exactly as she remembered it. She used the service elevator, her heart pounding with each floor. The elevator doors opened onto the rooftop, and Angela's breath caught in her throat. He was there. Bernard stood at the edge of the rooftop with his back to her, exactly where he'd been standing the night they'd made their promises. But this wasn't the confident billionaire she'd confronted in his office. This was a broken man, devastatingly thin, wearing clothes that hung loose on his frame. Around his neck was a chain, and hanging from it was her promise ring. The simple silver band she'd bought with her tip money. "Bernard," she whispered, and he went completely still. Slowly, as if afraid she might be a mirage, Bernard turned around. When their eyes met across the rooftop, Angela's heart shattered all over again. He looked like he'd been through hell, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow with the same pain she'd been carrying. But it was still him, still the man she'd fallen in love with. "Angela," he breathed, his voice cracking with 8 months of pain. She ran to him then, all her carefully planned words forgotten. They collided in the most desperate embrace she'd ever experienced, arms wrapped so tightly around each other they could barely breathe, both sobbing uncontrollably as 8 months of separation poured out in tears. "I'm sorry," Bernard kept repeating into her hair, his whole body shaking. "I'm so sorry, Angela. I'm sorry for lying. I'm sorry for hurting you. I'm sorry for being such a coward. I'm sorry for making you think I didn't love you when loving you is the only real thing I've ever done." Angela pulled back to cup his face in her hands, feeling the wetness of his tears mixing with her own. "I'm sorry too," she said through her sobs. "I'm sorry for not seeing that your love was real. I'm sorry for running away from the most beautiful thing in my life." Their first kiss, after 8 months of separation, was explosive, desperate, hungry, tasting of tears and forgiveness and infinite longing. They couldn't stop kissing, as if trying to make up for every missed moment, every night they'd lain, awake, yearning for each other's touch. Soft kisses, deep kisses, passionate kisses, punctuated by whispered apologies and declarations of love. Bernard lifted her off her feet, spinning her around as they laughed and cried simultaneously, both giddy with the impossible joy of being together again. "I never stopped loving you," Bernard whispered against her lips. "Every breath I took was because I hoped to see you again." Angela responded by kissing him so deeply he groaned with relief. "I never stopped wearing your ring," she confessed, showing him the chain around her neck. "Even when I hated you, I couldn't take it off." They sank to their knees on the rooftop floor, unable to let go of each other, kissing between every word, hands roaming over faces and bodies as if to confirm this wasn't a dream. "The clinic," Angela said between kisses. "All the scholarship, programs, my mother's medical care, that was all you, wasn't it?" "I had to," Bernard said, cupping her face. "I couldn't win you back, I knew that. But I couldn't stop loving you, couldn't stop wanting to take care of you and everyone you loved. It was the only way I could show you that what we had was real." "Wasn't all a lie," Angela said fiercely. "Ben was real, the man who held me in the rain, who made love to me under these same stars. He was real. You were more real than you'd ever been in your life." They made love right there on the rooftop, under the same stars where they'd first promised forever. This time it was desperate and passionate, filled with 8 months of longing transforming into pure, overwhelming love. Their bodies remembered each other perfectly, every touch electric, every kiss a promise. "I love Ben, I love Bernard, I love every version of you." Angela gasped as they moved together. "You became the man I fell in love with because love made you real." Bernard responded by making love to her with such tender intensity that they both wept from the beauty of it. 8 months of separation, making every touch feel like a miracle. When they reached their peak together, it felt like coming home. Afterward, they lay wrapped in each other's arms under the stars. Bernard slipped her promise ring back onto her finger with trembling hands, the simple silver band catching the starlight. "Marry me," he whispered against her lips. Marry me as whoever you need me to be, because I'm only myself when I'm loving you." Angela's answer was another soul-deep kiss. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to forever. Yes to building a life together. But I don't want to marry Ben or Bernard. I want to marry the man who became himself because of love." They talked until dawn, making plans and promises, sharing 8 months of pain, forgiving each other for the pride and fear that had kept them apart. As the sun rose over the city, they made love again with a tenderness that spoke of new beginnings. 6 months later, their wedding took place in the community centre Bernard had built next to the Morris Community Health Clinic. The entire neighborhood was invited, patients whose lives had been saved, families who'd benefited from scholarship programs, children who played in the mysteriously funded new park. Angela wore a simple white dress, but she'd never been more beautiful. Bernard wore the silver promise ring on a chain around his neck, visible beneath his shirt, a reminder of where their love had begun, as they danced to the same jazz song that had played in his tiny apartment during their first real date, both crying tears of joy. The whole community witnessed a love story that proved love could conquer lies, wealth, fear, and even the deepest betrayal when it was real enough to transform souls and move mountains. Their first dance as husband and wife was interrupted by applause from hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by their love story, not just by Bernard's money, but by the way their love had inspired him to become a better man, shown Angela that trust was worth the risk, proven that real love didn't care about bank accounts or social status. Real love cared about the heart, and Angela and Bernard had hearts that belonged together, no matter what names they used or what lies they told along the way. Years later, when they told their children how they met, they would speak of the lies that nearly destroyed them and the love that saved them both. They would talk about honesty and forgiveness, about how sometimes the best things in life come, disguised as the worst mistakes. But mostly, they would talk about love, the kind that doesn't quit, doesn't give up, doesn't accept defeat. The kind that builds clinics and funds dreams and forgives terrible mistakes because it sees the person behind the lies, the heart behind the fear, the truth behind the deception. The kind of love that conquers all, even when all seems lost. And in the end, that was the only truth that mattered.